This meeting is being recorded.
This webinar is being transcribed and summarized.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our second JPW for the 2025-2026 school year. Those of you that weren't able to join us for the secondary one in June for careers and CTE, welcome, because this is a K-12 event and we are so excited to have you here with us this evening. This workshop will begin very shortly, and you may have noticed that your microphone, your chat, and your video features have been disabled. You do not need to turn on any cameras. You don't have to worry about any audio, and I am thanking everybody way in advance for your understanding and patience with us as we have transitioned from Zoom webinar into WebEx webinar, and we're super excited to be here. We have done lots of professional development to learn this new platform and bring it to you here today live. And if we do have a few little hiccups there, please understand we apologize, and we are working to make this as seamless as possible. And this way we will have everything available for you like we have always done. This workshop is being recorded and it will be posted like always to our pinecharter.net website. I know that the registration may have looked a little bit different and things may look a little bit different, but we are promising you to offer still a fantastic experience, nothing less than what we have ever produced before. Just as we are going along this path, we just may have a few bumps in the road until we identify everything that is in this new platform for you. In order to submit a question, because you will have that opportunity to submit questions, and I see that some of you already have, there is a feature for the Q&A here, and it's called Slido. And so you may be able to see that within the bottom portion of your screen on the bottom under apps, or it just might say Q&A for you. And then it will be on the right-hand side of your screen. You will post your questions there, and then we will go through those as moderators and respond to those either in that moment through a reply through text, or we will hold your questions to our signature style of stopping and pausing, giving everybody a chance to digest some information, ask some questions, and then say those out loud, because we are aware that there may be more than one individual looking at a device. So we like to have those kinds of questions out and open for everybody. I don't want to talk too much and take too much of your time about some of the semantics of the system, so we're just going to get started. So on that next slide, we are super excited to present to you this evening our Jaguar Pointer Workshop for our summer series. And today you are so fortunate to be hearing the topic of understanding attention and focus strategies for student success from our very own Dr. Laura Cruz, who is the director of the Student Assistant Program and licensed psychologist and school psychologist here at the City of Pembroke Pines Charter Schools. You may have heard the term SAP. That is Miss Dr. Laura Cruz's department. And with her this evening, we have our panelist, Tracy Smith, who is a licensed clinical social worker, as well as other team members of mine, Miss Veronica Lesmus, who is part of the Office of Innovative Learning, Miss Jennifer Roca, who is also part of the Office of Innovative Learning. Thank you, Mr. Castellano, for our principal from our West Campus, for joining us this evening. And I have someone else in here, but I can't see who that is, so I apologize for if I'm not recognizing any of our other participants who are here with us from those departments or campuses. But we're very excited to have you. Again, I don't want to take too much time on the logistics of things, so we're going to move forward into that next slide. And that next slide being who are your point of contacts for your campus? So here we have school counselors by campus, and please, I beg everyone, put your pens down, put your notepads away, put your iPads and Apple Pencils away. I promise you'll have all of this information to reference back in that recording that will be loaded to our website like we've always had, and this way you will have the ability to peruse this and pause and have all of the information at your fingertips. So just sit back and relax and just sort of absorb what we're saying. But here are counselors by campus. At the Academic Village, we have our Director of School Counselors, which is Pearl Moses, and then we have a ninth grade counselor who is to be determined, 10th grade, which is Miss Gianna Scott, 11th grade, Miss Lisette Plaskett, 12th, Crystal Maycock. Then at our Academic Village Middle School is Jenny Lee Abulafia. Central Elementary Campus is Kimberly Lucretus. Central Middle Campus, Jill Bear. East Elementary Campus is Singrid Palau. FSU Elementary Campus is Miranda. West Elementary Campus is Mercedes Lambert, and our West Middle Campus is Deidre Blackburn. Our schools have also, for all of our students, a no-cost option for therapy through the programs offered through the Student Assistant Program, better known as SAP. And for any of these details, please contact any of the, not any, but your school-specific school counselor, or you can visit the pinescharter.net website for more information. But if you feel that you are interested in SAP or have other school counselor related issues, or if we reference during this presentation tonight, we urge you to reach out to your school specific counselor. This would be the list that you would reference. Later on, as Dr. Cruz is going through her presentation and we stop for Q&A points to talk, we are going to get through the whole presentation, and at the very, very, very end, we will talk about what is necessary to earn your hours for this session. All approved and eligible individuals who are here this evening, which would be moms, dads, and paternal and maternal grandparents, or any foster or guardians of families, or anybody that has been approved by a school administrator. Then you will complete our attendance and feedback form, and our hours will be entered, but that we'll talk about later. So we don't have to worry about any of those things. Also, at the end of this presentation, Dr. Cruz is going to drop a PDF version of her entire presentation there for download. So you have a new feature that we didn't have in Zoom, so we're super excited to be able to offer that to you, that you can download that this evening and have a hard copy should you choose to print it. So I don't want to talk any bit more, so this way you can get to the good stuff, and without any further ado, I'd like to pass it over to our presenter this evening, Dr. Laura Cruz.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm so excited to be here this evening to share a little bit on attention and focus and some strategies for student success. As Ms. Erica shared, I will be sharing perspective as a licensed clinical psychologist on this topic. And today we have kind of a twofold objective, hopefully. Our learning objectives are twofold, rather. The first thing is we're going to spend the first half of the presentation really understanding what is ADHD, or what a real attention problem is. That's a term that's used a lot nowadays, and perhaps a diagnosis that's kind of thrown around pretty readily. So hopefully from today's presentation, you'll gain a good understanding of what ADHD is, what are real attention problems, and then what are some of the deficits that come along with those problems. And those are called executive functioning challenges. And we'll learn a little bit about what those mean. Then the second half of the presentation, I hope you leave here today with some interventions and strategies to help your child improve in their attention and focus. The good part is that whether your child has ADHD, like a real attention diagnosis or not, the second half of today's presentation is going to be helpful for all to learn some strategies and interventions to help your child improve with focus and attention. So those are really the goals for today's presentation. I do want to just give some caveats before we get started. The first thing I want to kind of be candid about and share is that the research does tell us that the younger we teach our kids some of these interventions, the better chances they have of responding, right? So sometimes our younger kids can respond better than our adolescents, and I want to acknowledge that. So hopefully if we have parents here of some elementary children, it's the ideal time. That being said, I don't want our high school parents to be discouraged. These things will still be helpful, but I do want to acknowledge that the older our children get, the harder it is sometimes to intervene and learn, and change our patterns. The other thing that I want to acknowledge is that attention problems are some of the most commonly misdiagnosed, because it is normal to have some trouble with attention. It's developmentally normal for our children to struggle with maturity and have some behavioral issues. And so we can think, oh, they must have ADHD, they have an attention problem. And that's not true. And that's why it's one of the most misdiagnosed. So today, I hope you leave here understanding what are some normal kind of attention and behavioral problems versus what's something that might be a little more clinical, such as ADHD. So with that, I'm going to jump right into our content. So when we talk about ADHD, and that stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, we are talking about a neurodevelopmental disorder. One point of clarity that I like to make, and this is just more for your understanding, it's really just a matter of semantics, but so you have some of the proper term. I've heard a lot of people say sometimes ADD. And that's really a dated term. The actual term in the current DSM, and the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So that's what psychologists use to diagnose a disorder. So that DSM, we're actually by the DSM-5 TR, so the DSM-5 text revision, no longer includes the term ADD. Instead, we talk about something called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And a lot of parents might say, well, my child has trouble with attention, but not that hyperactive piece. Well, so what they've done is they just call the disorder ADHD, but then there's 3 subtypes. And those 3 subtypes can now be predominantly inattentive, the hyperactive impulsive type, or the combined type, which is both inattentive and hyperactive. I'm going to talk in a couple slides coming up a little bit more what the symptoms look like and what that real ADHD looks like, so you can start to discern, is my child just having normal problems with attention and focus, or is this crossing over to something that might need additional intervention and help? But so there it is now ADHD. There are those 3 subtypes, and ADHD is what we call a neurodevelopmental disorder, meaning it's always there and it is lifelong. The good news is that children can learn compensatory strategies or mechanisms that help them kind of make up for some of the deficiencies. And so you cannot always tell that it's there, especially when we move into adulthood. And sometimes it's hard to tell early on that the disorder is present. because the requirements for sustained attention aren't as challenging. So what that means is sometimes we can have a child that's always had it. Again, if you have ADHD, you've always had it. You were born with it, but you might not be able to tell in kindergarten or first grade because perhaps children only have to sustain attention for 15 or 20 minutes. Yet once we get into higher grades, like maybe middle school, some children are expected to sit through hour-long lectures or take hour-long exams. And that's when you really start to see the emergence of the symptoms such as that difficulty sustaining attention. Um, I'm going to get a little bit more into what those symptoms look like and also some of that neurobiology. I'm a big believer that if you understand why it happens or what it really is, you're much more going to be better equipped to then implement some of the strategies we'll learn later on. And then what causes ADHD? I do want to acknowledge that there is a genetic component to ADHD. The research is pretty clear that if you have a first degree biological relative, it really increases the likelihood. So there is an inherited genetic component. We are not yet at the point that we've identified like the exact gene. In fact, the research shows it's an interplay of various kind of genes and neurotransmitters. So we don't know exactly pinpoint, but it is clear that there is a hereditary component. The other thing that's clear in the research about these attention problems is that low birth weight increases the risk. So sometimes we can see a greater risk with premature babies to develop ADHD. Now, I want to be clear that most kids with low birth weight or that are born prematurely do not develop ADHD. So it's just a risk factor that can increase the chances, but it doesn't mean that it's not causational by any means. Okay, so let's jump into what are we talking about when we're saying ADHD? And to help you start to discern, is my child just having that, developmentally normal trouble with attention or maybe balancing large course load, or is this more of a significant problem that might need a little more help? So this slide has a lot of information on it. We're not going to necessarily cover it all. As Miss Erica shared, you will get a PDF copy. So at your leisure, you can read through this a little bit better. But I did want to just kind of include directly from that DSM manual that we use for diagnosis, what are the symptoms that are required for the diagnostic criteria of ADHD so you could get a better sense. And as I said, this was recently updated, the text revision. So this is as of 2022. This is the requirement to say we're to the level that these attention problems are something like ADHD. So first I'm going to cover, as I said, remember there's 3 subtypes. We're going to start with that predominantly inattentive presentation. So something you'll see here is that to meet the criteria, the child must have at least 6 of these symptoms, 6 or more. So that's going to help you start to say, okay, yeah, my child has 1 or 2 of these, but not 6 or more. And not only must a child have 6 or more of these symptoms, but they must be present for at least 6 months or more. So these have to be persistent. It can't just be like sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. And it has to impair their functioning in at least more than one setting. So it can't just be, well, only at school they have trouble paying attention. You're going to see at home, there must be some things maybe with chores or with tasks that we also see the symptoms. Because again, remember, this is neurodevelopmental. So children can't just turn it off and on. So those are also requirements that presentation is clear across settings. At home, at school, we see it maybe for older adolescents, in the workplace if they have a job. A lot of times for our teens, we can see it in other settings, like in driving. So there is some research to show that adolescents with ADHD are more likely to have, let's say, accidents or maybe citations because of some of these attention issues. So let's just quickly review what are some of the symptoms we would see in that ADHD inattentive presentation. So we would see that the child fails to pay close attention to details. So this is the kind of child that makes a lot of careless mistakes. Like they'll do a homework sheet and maybe instead of, if it was math problems, instead of adding, they subtracted, or instead of subtracting, they added. So a lot of those careless errors, and they don't kind of look over it and check for inaccuracy. difficulty sustaining attention, so kind of staying focused. Maybe at first they can pay attention, but after like 10 or 15 minutes they kind of lose focus or drift off. Sometimes these kids look like they're not listening or paying attention, and it's not that they're purposely being defiant, but really their mind is elsewhere, so that's why it seems like they're not listening or focusing. Not following through on instructions or failing to finish things. So starting the work and then getting a little bit of it done, but then kind of getting sidetracked and the task never seems to get fully finished. Kids with the predominantly inattentive presentation tend to also be very disorganized. Sometimes their desks or backpacks can be very messy, just kind of difficulty finding their papers. Also, poor time management. So, not just messy with their organization, but messy kind of with their time. And so, really, if they say, okay, I've got an hour before bed to finish this homework, and parent comes and checks an hour later and they've only done like 3 questions because they got distracted and went off and did something else. So, really poor time management. Again, I probably all parents can nod their head and say, oh, yeah, my child has that. I think most kids struggle with time management, which is why just keep in mind, can't just be one of these symptoms in isolation, but 6 or more. Because I would argue that it's pretty developmentally normative for all our children and adolescents to struggle with time management. Then there's this reluctance or avoidance to engage in tasks that require sustained mental effort, such as like schoolwork or homework. What's interesting is that we do see in kids with ADHD, when tasks are stimulating and have a lot of like positive stimuli, for example, video games or YouTube videos, they can almost hyper focus on those. So sometimes we can see kids with ADHD for hours and hours can focus on a video game or on YouTube videos, but for homework can't focus more than a few minutes. And that's always a tough one for parents to understand because they say, well, they don't have an attention problem. They can spend hours on this. Why can't they do it on this? But those are not really stimulating or engaging tasks. So that's where that struggle with attention comes in. So another kind of key feature is losing things, misplacing things, can't kind of find their materials. That ties back to that disorganization. Really easily distracted by the extraneous stimuli. So kind of maybe talking about one thing and all of a sudden they're like, well, oh, over there, did you see that? And kind of by something completely unrelated. And then really forgetting to follow through or finish tasks. So that's that predominantly inattentive type. Next, for the predominantly hyperactive type, again, we're looking for 6 or more symptoms, but these are different. This is that fidgeting, like so you see that feet or that leg kind of shaking all the time, or that tapping. Some of these students in class kind of always tapping that pencil, and I know the teachers get a little frustrated and annoyed with that noise. Leaving their seats, so hard to stay in your seat for a really long time, kind of keep having to get up and move. A lot of energy and moving around a lot, just can't sit still. Unable to do leisure activities that are just more quiet or sedentary, right? Just can't sit and for long periods of time. So that on the go, driven by a motor. Talking excessively. Again, I would argue I probably have that symptom, but remember, we're not looking for that one symptom in isolation. We're looking for at least 6 or more. Blurting things out before a question is complete. I know as a school psychologist doing evaluations with students who have ADHD, before I would even finish the question, they would give me an answer. And obviously the answer was wrong because they didn't take the time to hear the whole question. And we see that also sometimes on tests where they don't read thoroughly the instructions. And so they can get a lot of things wrong, not because they're not smart enough or don't have the capacity, because they're going a little too quickly or not taking the time to really fully read through something. And then interrupting or intruding on conversations. So that would be for the predominantly hyperactive presentation. Then for the combined presentation, we're looking at 6 or more in both areas. So hopefully by now you have a good understanding of what we're talking about when we mean a real clinical attention problem such as ADHD versus what might be a little more normative for children and adolescents. Now, don't want to spend too much time on the science and neurobiology, but for those parents who do have kids with ADHD, I think it can be so helpful once we understand why our kids are struggling with attention, and not that they're just doing this, or they're not trying hard enough, or they're not wanting to pay attention. Luckily, we are at the point where research has pinpointed what is happening in the brain that makes things like attention and focus harder for these youth, um, rather than being able to focus and sustain attention at like a typically developing youth. And this study was pretty groundbreaking. Back in 2007, a researcher named Shaw and his colleagues were able to do this big study where they did MRI imaging of brains. They had about 450 participants in this research study. And over the course of several years, they did brain imaging on these participants. I think starting from the age of 6 all the way to the age of 16, they did brain imaging on these almost 450 participants to understand what was happening. And what they found was there was two kind of big findings. They found that in the frontal cortex, that front part of the brain, there was what they call a hypomaturity of development, of kind of gray matter of development in that part of the brain. So that part of the brain developed normally, but it was a little delayed. On average, it was about a 2 to 3 year delay. So between 2 to 3 years, that part of the brain developed slower than typically developing brains, the ADHD brain. And then they found something else that was really interesting, was that on some of the ADHD children, the motor cortex, and that's kind of a little part of the back of the brain that is what's in charge of our gross motor, our movement, there was actually a hyper maturity of gray matter. So a little more activity and it developed kind of faster. So that's what we see in our hyperactive kids. There's actually more activity in that motor part of the cortex, which is why they literally can't sit still. They actually have more activity in that part of the brain, which makes it so hard for them to control their movements or sit still. So just kind of another slide to just kind of show how they studied this over the 6 years, comparing the ADHD brain to that typically developing brain. And as I said, that they noticed those differences of about an average to a 2 or 3 year delay just in that frontal part of the cortex. And I'm going to talk about what that means and what that impairs. But a couple things that I want to share before I continue is that brain imaging is still not ready for use of diagnosis in ADHD. So although they were able to kind of detect this delay, it was only with a very large amount of children with a disorder and over the course of time that they could see this. So it's not yet possible, though, to go into a doctor or neurologist and say, can I have an MRI to see if my child has ADHD? That's not the way we diagnose it. So the diagnosis of ADHD remains clinical, and it's really based on taking history and then really collecting information from teachers and parents. So a lot of times if you talk to your pediatrician and start to say, I don't know if my child has an attention problem or ADHD, a lot of pediatricians will say, go ahead and have your child's teacher fill out these forms, right? And that is the correct way. And then they'll ask you to fill out that form because they're looking for that impairment in functioning, and we want to see it across settings. So right now, you can't just take your child to a doctor and they get a brain scan and they say, yes, you have ADHD. That's not the way it works. So what that delay in the brain, that frontal cortex at about on average 3 year delay, that part of the brain is in charge of what we call executive functions. The good news is that children with ADHD don't have things like their intelligence affected. That part of the brain has nothing to do with or at least it's not fully, right, IQ. So most kids with ADHD can still be as smart, if not smarter than their peers. What we're going to see impaired, and it's just delayed about 3 years, is these 9 areas, these executive functions. I'm going to go through them quickly and explain them. The first area is what we call inhibition, and that's what we describe as the ability to resist an impulse, right? So to stop your behavior at the appropriate time. I'm in the middle of doing a presentation right now, so I know I'm not going to go over there, grab my cell phone and check my text messages because I'm inhibiting that impulse. Kids with ADHD have trouble doing that. Focus and sustaining attention. That is not getting, again, distracted. And as I said, some of that ties into number 3, which is shifting attention, moving from one thing or another. Sometimes they can hyper focus on a stimulating task and not be able to shift. So stay in that video game and can't turn it off, or that, those videos, and shift over to start the work because they're so engrossed in that stimulating task and they don't know how to move freely from one situation to another. And that's hard, right? The ability to transition, or okay, I finished this assignment, now I have to go on to this, or I finished this step, now I need to move to this. Another thing that the frontal lobe, which is impaired in or a little bit delayed in kids with ADHD, is emotional control. And that's regulating our emotions, right? So not like overreacting, not being overly sensitive, or having like big emotions for something that doesn't seem that big. So sometimes we can see what we call dysregulation in our children with attention problems. Initiation is another one of the executive functions, and that is the ability to just get started. So sometimes we see in our kids with ADHD, it's so hard to just start the work, get started, get going. That is one of the hardest things to do. Working memory. So for working memory, it's just not that long, like not remembering things that happened a long time ago, but in the moment, hearing something or seeing something, retaining it, and then producing an output. That's really important for learning. So like if you're in class, hearing your teacher say something, doing what they told you to do in that moment, and then maybe raising your hand and answering the question. That's where working memory plays a little bit more of a role. Planning and organizing. So planning and organizing is just managing your current tasks and thinking about the future. So I have to do A, B, and C in order to get the product of D, let's say. Task monitoring. That's staying on top of their own performance to ensure accuracy and goal attainment. So to put this into context, remember we said on average we see a 2 to 3 year delay for kids with ADHD. So let's say you have a 10-year-old child, their ability to do some of these functions is more just this area, not everything else, but on these things, like their ability to pay attention is more like a 7-year-old. And so that's where we get really frustrated or see some differences, especially in parents that have more than one child. We tend to compare and say, well, your sister or your brother didn't have this. Why is it so hard for you to just sit down and do your work? And again, we might compare by age, and we fail to notice that our, let's say, 10-year-old is really more like a 7-year-old in these areas with that 3-year delay, or a 15-year-old is more like a 12-year-old in their ability to shift or organize or get started or plan, and those kinds of things. So I think that's really important context. The good news, and why a lot of times some people say, oh, they grew out of that ADHD, is that as we get into our mid 20s, early 30s, that difference is no longer as significant. So if we have a 30-year-old that's paying attention like a 27-year-old, that's not really a big difference, right? But when we have a 10-year-old that's paying attention like a 7-year-old, that's really noticeable at that point. So the good news is, especially for that inattentive type, once we get into adulthood, it really doesn't impair as much. What you will see for that hyperactive type is, as adults, still a lot of trouble. There's still that overactivity in that gross motor strip, right? So they still tend to be more restless and move and have trouble sitting still and lots of energy. But these areas no longer inhibit as much as they might in early childhood. All right, so hopefully I got through the first half and I did a good job of explaining just what are attention problems. And I'd love to pause here and see if there are any questions from the Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Cruz. I am just trying to get my video back on. Give me one sec. There we go. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, this is the time that we all sort of gather our thoughts based on the information that was so well put together and presented by Dr. Cruz. And you can use that Slido. Those of you that may have been coming in maybe a little bit late, which we understand, it's, dinner time, pickup time, camp time, it's summertime, pool time, all those things, and it's all of the above. It's okay if you've come in a little later. If you look to the right of your screen, you'll see something that calls Slido or Q&A, and that is where you would drop your questions. And because we are aware that we ask that one login be per family or household, that there may be multiple individuals around a singular device. So we like to read those out. So this is your time, ladies and gentlemen, to go ahead and ask your questions, and then we will read them out loud, and then we will have Dr. Cruz respond. So our beginning question is, what is suggested for parents with kids that seem to be addicted to iPads?
Yeah, that's tough. And as I said, it's really, first of all, right, there's a huge kind of social media and media problem with youth nowadays. We're in a new era where even the American Academy of Pediatrics, which used to limit recommendations to times, has had to change that recommendation because there's so much use of media and technology, even for school. So they no longer say like just 1 or 2 hours. What they say is kind of it should be guided kind of by a media plan. And again, if you that's a resource you ever want to check out, the American Academy of Pediatrics has a media plan that you can download and do. And looking at, is it impairing? Is it getting in the way of things that are priorities for you and your family? So let's say sleep. Good sleep is a priority. So this is the limit. Like at this time, it has to be put away. Homework is, or doing work or getting good grades is important for my family. So once homework is done, that's when it can be used, right? So kind of setting up those limits and those expectations. Some families might say, having a family meal without technology is important for my family, so that's a time that devices are also not allowed. So it's more about setting up usage around meeting expectations rather than so much just saying 20 minutes a day and that's it, because a lot of times it's hard to stick to those parameters for various reasons. So it's more like if A, B, and C are done, then you can have some time. And again, it is harder for kids with ADHD to shift or let go of that technology usage. What I will also just remind you all is that for our kids with ADHD, remember we're looking at kind of like that 3-year delay in that area. So you really have to be explicit in setting up those expectations and kind of going moment by moment. So an example would be, okay, right now it's homework time. If you finish this worksheet, then you can use the iPad for 20 minutes. So really explicitly setting it up in those moments, right? So once you finish this worksheet, then you can use the iPad for 20 minutes. Some kids benefit from having like that timer. Some kids that can be tough because once they see the time running out, so you have to kind of gauge that for your own family. But I would say those explicit guidelines. That's hard for some parents because some parents say, my child is a teen. I shouldn't have to give them those like I should they're old enough, they should be independent enough that they can use it and put it down when they need to. But remember, for this area, if they're kind of 3 years behind, they might need that explicit guidance from you still. Well, hopefully that answers that question.
Fantastic. Moving on to our next question. How can a parent help support their child in completing homework?
I would say, and we're going to get into specific strategies for the areas of executive functioning in the second half of today's presentation. So I think it's really going to help you. So actually, I'd like to say I want to table that, and after the second half, if that they feel
Perfect.
that question isn't answered, to please ask it again.
Fantastic. Can laziness or lack of interest in school be confused for ADHD?
I would say yes. As I mentioned earlier today, it's one of the most commonly misdiagnosed disorders because a lot of kids it's developmentally normal to be like, I prefer to play video games than do work, right? It's not always stimulating. It's not always engaging. There are motivational issues that can take place. So I would say yes. And then I would say what would help you better discern is that, is it, can you check off at least 6 of those symptoms in your child, or is it just the only one is lack of motivation, and not in conjunction with at least 5 more of those other symptoms?
Okay,
Yeah, great
fantastic.
question.
If my child meets the criteria, what steps do I take to get assistance in the school for my child?
Great. So I would say we share like the school counselors, kind of reaching out to them first to see. Um, the other thing I would want to emphasize is that one of the not just the symptoms, but that we see an impairment in functioning, right? So sometimes kids can have some of the symptoms, but they're still doing great. They're getting great grades, or they're not falling behind. If they are falling behind, for sure, reach out to the school counselor. And then a lot of times, the next step is to go ahead and have your pediatrician give you those forms. They send those forms back, like they'll give the parent the form, make an appointment with the pediatrician, share the concerns with the pediatrician. Those forms will come to the school. Teachers and parents will fill out those forms. And then they will look and see if your child would benefit from additional accommodations. That can be something like a 504 plan, or in kids that need even more, then they can even move on to something called an IEP, an individualized education plan.
Perfect. And the last question for now, are there any specific recommendations for children that become hyper-focused on something and being repetitive?
So it sounds like we're asking a little more about like perseveration, like getting stuck on the same thing and wanting to go, which might be, that might be outside of ADHD. ADHD is more just hyper focus and then trouble shifting. I will give some recommendations today for helping kids shift from one thing to another. Um, but for that, like perseveration, sometimes we'll inadvertently reinforce it. So let's say they keep wanting to talk. I've had kids that maybe at the elementary age love to talk about dinosaurs, and everything goes back. We're talking about this, and the conversation comes back to dinosaurs, and keep on with that, and keep on that.
Schools.
Different kind of tricks for how to not keep reinforcing it. So not keep talking about that and switch to something else, or setting up parameters. So again, I hope with the strategies today we'll answer some of those. If those are still lingering, I encourage parents to ask those again.
Fantastic. And with that, we're going to ask everybody to pause your questions for us. These are fantastic questions coming through. If some of your questions were not announced live, it's not that we don't want to answer you, and we do have Miss Tracy Smith in the background responding to those. We just are choosing a few to go live, so this way we can continue on with the content of our presentation. So at this time, if everybody can kind of pause on your questions, and we are going to continue, and then we'll have another stopping point. Thank you so much, and we will resume at this time.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I see. I'm sure it's hard to get to all of them because I see on my thing like 24 came through. So I'm sure it's hard to get to every single question, but hopefully we'll get to as many as we can. So I will continue on with the presentation and jump into, I think, the piece that a lot of questions were starting to touch on, which is what are some of the strategies? And so the best way that I thought we could start laying this out is by those areas of executive functioning that were impaired, or we will see impaired in kids with ADHD. How do we provide some interventions specifically targeting those areas? And then I'll give some more general and broad recommendations. I know there's a lot of information on these slides. I just want to remind everyone that I will give you the PDF so you can read through it more at your leisure. It's kind of on purpose that I wrote a lot so that parents could really take their time after today's presentation and pick and choose some that they wanted to try in their home. So if you recall, I mentioned earlier in the presentation that inhibition is one of the areas that it can be deficient in kids with ADHD, right? So resisting that impulse or stopping your behavior at the appropriate time. So kids with inhibitory controls require additional environmental structure. So this can include things like more explicit, extensive, or clear rules and expectations, and then reviewing those regularly. So one example is, again, I'll go back to kind of like that middle age, like let's say an 11 or 12-year-old child, And you would say, well, they're in middle school already, and I don't need to tell them what's the appropriate behavior for this place because they're old enough to know. But remember, this child has trouble with inhibiting. So instead of a typical 12-year-old, we might be looking more at like a 9-year-old. So you might have to remind them, we are going to go to this place. Let's use the library as an example. So we're going to the library right now. Remember, in the library, we need to talk in a lower tone of voice. And we need to put, if you grab a book, after you grab it, you have to put it back. And that might seem silly to some parents, but they do need that more explicit and clear set of rules or expectations. And again, reviewing them regularly for each setting. So we are going to go to so-and-so's house right now. While we're there, here's what I want to see you do. And also important that you explain to children, to youth and adolescents, what you want to see them do rather than what you don't want. Like, I don't want you doing this, and I don't want you doing that, and I don't want you doing that. So really reminding them what they should be doing. Environmental structure is really important. So settings that have too many distractions lead to that more impulsive behavior, right? So if they're, let's say, doing homework in a room where there's the TV and there's maybe in their bedroom where there's a lot of toys and stuff, and you walk in 15 minutes later and they're out of their desk and they're over there playing with that, that's because that environment is tough for that particular youth to focus. And remember, they can't inhibit that impulse to get up and go over there and play with something else rather than focus. So one easy fix is to provide youth with an environment that is a little more structured and free of distraction. So a lot of times for kids, that might be not doing homework in their bedroom, but maybe like in a desk or a living room, or sometimes a dining room table has a little less distraction, and that's the best area to get work done. These kids will need a little more redirection and limit setting. Sometimes placement in close proximity can help. So if you're telling them something and they're in another room, you think they're hearing you because you're talking loud, but they're distracted. So coming close to them, making eye contact to make sure that they heard and understand you. Workloads can be really daunting for kids with impulse control because they're going to do a few and then get distracted and go to something else. So chunking or breaking up assignments is really helpful. So what that looks like is, okay, we've got this big sheet to do and there's 20 problems. Go ahead and get 5 done. After you get 5, come and show me. We'll talk in the next couple slides about adding motor breaks or little like kind of reinforcers. But basically after 5, they can have a little break or do something else and then come back and then do another 5 instead of trying to do all 20 at once. Because kids with ADHD, when it's so much, we're going to get leadway to careless errors, that distractibility, that inhibition, that poor inhibition is going to kick in. So really breaking up and having more stepwise and increasing expectations stepwise, little by little, is a good technique. Another thing that's helpful to teach our youth with inhibition, and this one's more probably easier for teens to learn. They have a little more insight into, oh, I just blurted that out. And then later, or with their peers, they have a lot of social conflict because they say things without thinking. And then their friends are mad. Or in class, they get in trouble a lot because they blurt something silly out to the teacher and they have a lot of discipline issues. So this strategy is good for teens to learn, is a response delay technique, and say, before you say something, count to 5 before you say it out loud, because that allows them a moment to think about what they're going to say instead of just saying automatically what's on their mind and getting themselves into trouble. So those response delay techniques, really helpful for the teens who already recognize, oh, I just say dumb things and it gets me in trouble and I don't mean to say it. So that's a great strategy for them. And then asking our students, our children, to verbalize their plan of approach before starting work. That again helps inhibit that impulse response and then makes them have a plan, because that planning is also deficient in a lot of our kids. So, all right, you've got this project to do and there's a lot of steps. Or let's say you've got this reading assignment to do and there's a lot of steps. First, you're going to tell them the steps, right? Because that's that first recommendation that we saw up here to kind of give them more explicit, extensive. Here's what I recommend you do. I recommend you read the passage. Then I recommend you underline the important statements. Then read the questions, go back to your underlined parts to see if you find the answer, put your answer, and then go back and check all your responses. So that's what you're telling them to do. This is obviously more for a teen that can have bigger multi-step, and say, okay, so now you tell me what's your plan with this assignment, and have them tell you back their plan step by step. All right, so those are some strategies for the inhibition. Let's move on now to some strategies for the shift and initiating difficulties. A daily schedule can be really helpful, especially getting home from school. I hear a lot of times, like with teens, or that even came up in one of the questions, where just using the iPad and they lose all their time. But what I hear a lot of time with our teens is, okay, they get home and they're eating, then they watch TV, then they're on their phone, and by the time they get to homework, it's 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and they don't finish until midnight. Right? And then that poor sleep hygiene is going to affect their attention, their mood, and it just is like this whole horrible negative cycle because they're just waiting too long, that poor time management, and then not sleeping enough. So coming up with a daily schedule and reviewing it can really help. Like, okay, here's what we're going to do. When you get home, you do need some time to decompress because you've been learning a lot. So it's a 30-minute break. And then, so let's say at 5 o'clock, you're going to then do work for 30 minutes. Then at or 5:30, you're going to take a little snack break. Then at 5:45, you're going to work until 6:30. That's dinner time. So kind of coming up with a daily schedule that makes sense for the youth and for your family can really help. Making sure that we're only focusing on one thing at a time. Sometimes kids can get really overwhelmed, like I have so much to do, and they start one assignment then go to another one, and they kind of don't finish any really well. So presenting one task at a time and also limiting choices can be helpful. Children have difficulty with changes, with shifting. Remember, stopping one task and going to the next one. Warnings can be helpful. So like a 2-minute warning. This can also be really helpful for kids when in that schedule they have like a little TV break or an iPad break, but it's really hard for them to switch from that to then homework. I hear a lot of that, like, okay, if I give it to them, then they won't want to switch, to doing their work. So sometimes that warning can help, or even if it's time for bed and it's the TV's going to come off and it's time for bed, starting with that warning. And some kids need more than just one warning. Like, here's a 5-minute warning, a 2-minute warning. Okay, time is up for this. External prompting might be necessary to help some of these kids get started. So telling them, all right, let's get started. Here's what we've got to do. Even starting the first problem, showing them the first problem before they go on and do it on their own. Having limits set for completing a task, because again, there's that really poor time management. So, all right, you're going to do these 5 problems. These 5 problems should be done in 15 minutes. Okay, so let's set the timer and you kind of look at the time and see where you're by. And if you're not getting close to done at the end of the 15 minutes, you're not working quickly enough. That's also called self-monitoring, and that's really helpful for kids with ADHD to start learning how to monitor their own productivity. And they can really feel overwhelmed. So again, I talked about this earlier, breaking tasks into smaller chunks. That chunking can be really helpful for kids with some of these attention problems. We talked about that working memory can be deficient. So something that really helps with this, and it might seem counterintuitive, is actually some short breaks. These breaks need to be only 1 or 2 minutes in between. But after working for a sustained period of time, for some kids, like after 15 to 20 minutes, they lose focus. Actually, what will help them focus again is taking a quick break. It is recommended that break for them most of the time should include some motor activity or like a complete kind of disconnect and relaxing. So what that means is, okay, after 15, 20 minutes of doing work, go ahead and take 2 minutes to walk around, to get up, to go get a drink, to do some jumping jack. I've seen teachers in classes do like, okay, we're going to do a jumping jacks or a stretch break or something like that. So that would really help, taking that break, walking around and getting back, because remember, they have that extra, especially that hyperactive type, that extra motor activity. So it is hard to stay seated and sustain attention for so long. For some kids, some reinforcement breaks work. So kind of, okay, you're going to do 15 to 20 minutes of work. And then you have 2 minutes where you get to, some kids love to like doodle and draw, let's say. You get a 2 minute doodle and drawing break. And then when the timer goes off, back to the 15 more minutes of work. So things like that. These students learn better with more strategies for memory. So things like mnemonic devices, right? Like acronyms, a lot of rehearsal. So kind of saying it over and over, repeating. Sometimes it's saying it out loud, writing it, looking at it. So more than one like multimodal approach to learning helps to encode that information. Memorizing list or key facts helping, and then space practice is more effective than massed practice. So what that means is like that cramming, like 5 straight hours of learning versus a few, maybe there's a big test on Friday, instead of trying to cram it all in Thursday night, spreading out the learning a little bit every day and practicing and working on it a little bit every day is more helpful. Some other simple things for parents. Anticipating behaviors is such a basic strategy, and we do it when our kids are really young. It's common sense. As our kids get older, it's harder to think about this. But when we have toddlers, we know to put the cleaning fluids in a locked cabinet or high up where the kids can reach the cleaning fluids, right? We know that's called a simple. We anticipate they might get that, and it's called a simple environmental control, a preventative strategy. We're going to put this out of the way. But we failed to do that as our kids get older. So like I said, if we know our child is easily distracted, a simple strategy would be, okay, let's not put them in the room with the TV, or let's not put the TV in the bedroom. So structuring our environment in a way that would help them. There's an example of a coffee spilling here, and it's kind of silly, but I know that kids with ADHD can tend to spill more, or kind of be a little more careless and be a little more messy by accident sometimes. So maybe during homework, not having a cup of water right there, that would be another example of anticipating a behavior, and then that preventative environmental control. I'm going to talk a little bit as we get close to the tail end here of the strategies about how we can use consequences to reinforce desirable behavior. Positive consequences make it more likely for a behavior to happen again. A negative consequence, so things like a punishment, is when you want to stop a behavior. If we want to do something like help our child increase them doing their homework or paying attention, we really want to try to use more positive consequence. A lot of times as parents, we default to negative consequence, meaning like, okay, you're not doing your homework, you're getting all F's, no iPad, no video games, no phone, right? We use a lot of punishment. And that's okay. It's okay to give our children consequences, but also think if we want to, the goal is to make them do more homework, we also need to add some positive consequences in there, right? Some sort of kind of, in essence, rewards. I will say that complicated reward systems don't work for kids with ADHD because it has to be immediate. They live in the here and now. So we actually don't need this like sophisticated kind of like chart over the course of time. Although those are good, sometimes we want something more simple and clear. So kind of leads us to our next slide, which is immediate, frequent, and consistent. We want to be specific in what we need them to do and what is the positive consequence if they do that, right? So instead of finish your work or you'll be in trouble, which is kind of like vague kind of directive, and then a consequence, it's more effective if we say complete 10 minutes of these problems, or I'm sorry, complete these 10 problems before 8 p.m. And if you do that, you can have some time on the computer. Okay, so if you do this, here's the reward you can access. Immediate, specific, consistent, and more in the here and now. I've had parents, families that I've worked with in therapy and treatment tell me, nothing works for my child. Do you know, here's an example of actually one family that I worked with. They told me, I promised my child for Christmas that they would get, and I can't remember what it was at the time, the newest, most expensive gaming system. I don't know, like a PlayStation or a Switch. It was very hard to get one and a really expensive one. And the parent was willing to buy that for their child because that's the thing that their child wanted the most.